I believe that this OEM has got certain data that could assist this investigation, then if it is made available, you may have it heard in a private hearing if it is, sensitive information or commercially sensitive information to, manufacturers of devices or technology. Concerned about privacy, we'll take the time to read and understand, what's going on with regards to that. But it's very, very challenging, time consuming and expensive field, to be fair, because the automotive industry is not cheap.
Okay. Hi, Noel. How are you?
Hey, I'm good, Denise. Thank you.
Thanks for being here today. Thanks for taking the time.
No, thanks for having me on. I really like the stuff that Screens are doing, and for us to be able to have a chat around the stuff that you've going on in your world and some of the stuff that's going on in our world. It's really good to collaborate, and I think you're doing some real good stuff. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you guys today.
Yeah, and you're a very particular guest. So just a little background. I am an avid watcher of crime documentaries. And when I first looked at your LinkedIn profile, the first words that I saw was forensic and investigation. And of course, my crime peaky brain immediately jumped to the thought of that's exactly what you're doing. But that's not exactly what you're doing. So you do have a background as a police officer for a very long time, right?
Yes, well, 17 years, yes. And yeah. I was responsible in the main for investigating fatal road collisions as part of a dedicated department as my career ended up. And I guess my skill set was incorporating different skills into that investigation, whether it be forensic collision investigation, digital investigation, interviewing of witnesses and drivers that have been involved, and pulling all that together to try and find the truth and to give people answers as to, why somebody had lost their lives. And as things developed, as part of a dedicated department, dealing with that amount of death is not healthy, in my opinion. And because that's all you're doing, you're just exposed to that all the time. Whenever you go to work, it's just, devastation. Combined with a lot of other factors that would be a separate podcast in its own right, I decided to make the shift out of the police and to pursue a career related to the investigation of serious crime or serious collisions involving vehicles, and to have the freedom to do some things that was happening in the digital world and in the vehicle space that perhaps I wouldn't been able to do in a restricted role in a massive organisation. So we've had a company now for the last 7 years, and this supports serious crime and serious collision investigation by the way of acquiring data from vehicles that can potentially assist in either a serious collision investigation or indeed a serious crime, because of the nature in where a lot of vehicles are going, in the sense that they are becoming data hubs that can assist in that type of thing. So I've got the background of dealing with serious cases in criminal courts, but also in coronial courts where you're trying to give people the answers as to why their loved ones died. And I'm a great believer in trying to get to the truth and finding out what's happened to give people answers in their most difficult of circumstances, really. So that's essentially where we're at after, sort of 23 years. I started out as a police officer, but still actively involved, but not as the police officer as such, as an external forensic provider.
So you couldn't let go of your police career entirely, but you made it part of your new job.
Yeah, exactly that. Policing has changed over the last, it's constantly changing. It will never be the same, but I think the police need to pull on specialists now in all sorts of different types of investigations. And in years gone by, police officers and police forces would try and get that internal capability. Whereas now there's a lot more shift towards utilising experts in all sorts of different fields and specialists in various different fields to support the police in their efforts to try and police, a difficult world sometimes, and the advent of, digital communication and, digital crimes and the way that crimes are being committed and facilitated these days. it does require that. And I think people are, whereas before the police used to be sort of a career for life, there's a lot more people dipping in and dipping out, maybe getting that experience in various different areas, and it's a little bit more of a relying on a whole group of different people with different skill sets and different backgrounds to be able to tackle things effectively, really.
Now, you said you've been doing this for 7 years now. So were you one of the first people to start a business like that, or were people before you that did a similar thing, but not maybe as detailed as you, or did you have a different approach to the matter?
I think here in the UK, we were maybe one of the first people to offer digital downloads of vehicles. And at the time, around 2016, the downloading of a car for an investigation in the UK was a one-off. It wouldn't necessarily be a routine thing to do. We certainly weren't the first in respect of, digital evidence, because there are a lot of digital forensic companies that will, download mobile phones and computers. And, that's been going on, since, the 90s, really, in respect to digital devices and how they've integrated. I guess the vehicle just presents a different challenge to a more traditional digital forensics because of the technology that are being used on a vehicle, and people at the time we started had limited solutions to check, vehicles to get data from them that might assist in serious investigations. I perhaps got a little bit aware of this whilst I was still in the police, in respect of just the crash data, shall we say, around a vehicle, what's happening in the last 5 seconds before a crash occurs, and started to see some technologies that were in use for getting investigative data off a vehicle for that type of investigation. The stuff from infotainment was very, very much in its sort of infancy at that stage. Mm-hmm. I'd say globally there was things happening in other countries whereby I was alerted to the fact that this type of data was available, and as an investigator, that was really interesting to me to think how that could help and how that could interface into a serious investigation and crack a lot of crimes, really. So we had a passion for that, but the difficulty to get data off these systems presents unique challenges, really, that requires, again, sub skill sets from different areas, whether it be automotive and master technicians that are working with vehicles versus people that can take a chip off a circuit board and then start to reconstruct data and understand proprietary file systems that have been developed as part of an infotainment system. So it's a really challenging role, because if you just imagine, I'm sure you're aware how many vehicles are on the road, how many different systems are out there. And you've got to deal with and manage people's expectations, because you may give them data from a vehicle and it'd be really good and helpful, and then they'll come along the next time they've got a vehicle involved, but it could be slightly different make, model, year, and it's got completely different technologies on there, and you may not have a solution straight away to be able to get that off. So there's a lot of expectations to manage, and it's just a really challenging area from that point of view in respect to the volume of different vehicles that we can come across. And if I'm dealing with vehicles that are on the roads in Europe and the UK, I could end up going to Asia or the States or Australia and see vehicles that I've never encountered before, and not have any solutions for that. So it's a really still a big growing space as far as the vehicle system forensics community is concerned, and the solutions are by no means complete. Like anything, it'll be an evolving world as to where we go. Without jumping too far ahead, we're already in a situation where a lot of data is on the cloud anyway, to do with modern vehicles. But I guess the vehicle population, once a car's out there, it could be out there for 20 years or more, and it could still be involved in serious crimes 15 years down the line after rolling off the production line, whereby data is being stored physically on the vehicle that you would still access. So there's plenty of scope for work in the future in this field, whether it be jumping forward to where vehicles may end up and where data may end up.
Hmm.
versus what's out there now and what could be out there for another 10 or 15 years.
So it's a constant learning process.
Absolutely, yeah. No 2 days are the same. It's very challenging, very frustrating. You can be repeating the same process and expecting a different result, which some people define as insanity. But that's just sometimes the nature of the work. But it can be very rewarding as well when you do find a solution or you do get data off the car for, an investigation that either nobody else can do, or it gives you the answers that nowhere else would have given you the answer, to that question. And if you're trying to find out the truth in respect to why somebody's died, then there can't be a bigger duty owed on another individual to investigate that death, and they need to get to the right answers. So it's interesting, it's challenging, and getting the data is one thing. Interpreting the data is can be another, and putting a reliance on that data as to what it actually means, is also a key area of work. Analysis of data and how it interfaces with the investigation and what your interpretation of that data
Hmm.
is can be difficult, because you might have a software engineer that has developed this system and put things in place for their purposes. You never speak to that person, or you never know their true intentions as to why they were recording that data and what it actually means. So you've got to
Hmm.
scratch under the surface. Can involve a lot of testing to validate and prove what you believe to be the case. So it's very, very challenging, time consuming, and expensive field, to be fair, because the automotive industry is not cheap.
Yeah, that's true. And also, you mentioned it earlier, it's an ever changing, I guess, department or area. So if you say there's a lot of different system, obviously, not only when it comes to design, but also a change for different generations or different countries. Now, how do you approach this type of subject if you have different systems? Because you mentioned it's a lot of work. It's very, very detailed. It's very, I guess, hard sometimes. How do you approach different systems and different designs, and also different designs in different countries or different infotainment systems for different generations?
I mean, from our perspective, we're generally working immediately off what data is somebody after, and then we've got to look at the features of the vehicle as to whether or not that data type could be there, and what's actually, what the vehicle's been involved in. So, very simplistically, if somebody was after GPS data as to where that vehicle had been, first of all, does it have an inbuilt sat nav? Because some modern infotainment systems for different markets don't have an inbuilt sat nav. They may be requiring it to be mirrored off the handset, such as Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. So we need to understand what features of this infotainment system are there, and then it's all about then solutions on knowing whether or not that system does actually store that data on some sort of storage medium inside the unit, whether it be a chip, whether it be a hard drive, whether it be embedded SD cards, embedded micro SD cards, and it's trying to work out where on that unit is the data, if indeed it is stored, and then it's a method to be able to get that data off. So in a lot of cases, because we don't turn a vehicle down, it's kind of research on the hoof until we've done a system and seen a system, and then know where it is to either develop a solution that we can use in-house to get that data off the next time we see that infotainment system, or it's speaking to other people in the community and finding out whether or not they've experienced that unit before and what they found on it. Because if we're going to, let's just take an example of wanting that GPS data off, say, a witness's car that might have had a suspect in it, and we want to show where that's gone. If that vehicle belongs to, a witness, and the only way we can check for data is to maybe remove a chip off the printed circuit board,
Hmm.
we could be into £3,000 to £4,000 to replace that infotainment module so that they get the car back in the same state that it's in. And that's another factor, is the cost. And like I touched upon, the automotive industry is not cheap. don't don't go and buy a car. Don't go buy a car of parts and try and build it. Just buy the car outright, because as expensive as it looks, it will be a lot more expensive to buy it by individual components. When we're talking in some cases, £3,000 to £4,000 for an infotainment system. In other cases, and this is where you've got to try and reach out to different areas of the automotive industry where cars have been damaged. You might want to get your hands on those damaged cars so that you've got some components that you don't mind damaging and checking, so that you can then better project in the future whether or not that vehicle and that system is worthy of pursuing for that data type. But the salvage market is massive, and people don't really want to give away components that they could be selling as part of salvage for people that are willing to put second-hand parts onto vehicles as well. So it can be problematic from that point, but it's mainly research as we go forward.
So you have to convince people to agree to give them.
We do,
the
thankfully.
cars sometimes.
Thankfully, we've got some, shall we say, open-minded investigators that kind of take the approach that, well, we want to check because somebody's dead, and we don't want to be in a situation whereby we've missed something. And you've got to, it forms part of a strategy really as to what else is going on in the investigation, as to whether or not you need that. But if you've got nothing, you've got no CCTV, you've got no witnesses, you're stuck. You might have a body that's missing that you think's dead, and this car might have transported the body to a deposition site. Then the decision becomes easier to do that. And for us, it's good on two fronts. One, we're helping the investigation, but two, if it's a system we've not seen before, it allows us to learn. So we're really grateful to those people that give us that flexibility and robustness. And it all depends on how strong the investigator is really as to how they're going to deal with that person if they're going to make a claim against them for, I don't know, loss of a part, or you've changed the vehicle. If I take it back to my earlier days in policing, if somebody had some intelligence to say that the house 3 doors down from me were dealing drugs, the police may go and raid that house, knock the front door down, go in, and in those days, perhaps the police wouldn't replace the front door because they had good intelligence to suggest that drugs were being dealt on there. Similarly, now you want to knock the door down on the infotainment system to see whether or not there is GPS data there. Do you necessarily need to replace the infotainment system? Or do you want to be a little bit more robust with your suspect, depending on their level of involvement and what evidence you've got to say that they are involved, if that is a factor in that as well. So it can be difficult, but equally there are a lot of non-destructive solutions that we use techniques for to get the data off. And maybe if we are destructive in the first place, we can then develop a non-destructive solution because we can work out how data is getting onto the chip from other areas of the circuit board, and we interface with the circuit board differently on the next time. So somebody has to, in the first instance, carry the can, so to speak, and make that decision. But then that can mean that the next time they get that type of car, we might have a non-destructive solution for it. So it might have cost it in the first place, but on the second occasion, we're not as destructive in our approaches. And then there are other sort of tools and techniques that you can use within the automotive industry as regards diagnostic tools and other third-party devices, shall we say, that we would plug into the vehicle to, try and read data, all depending on the nature of the investigation.
Now, would you say there's systems that are easier to investigate than others?
Yes, there are some for which we have solution for, and they give us good data. And then there are ones when people come to us and say, "Oh, we've got this vehicle," and we work out it's a certain system. It's like, no.
In your head, you're already thinking, no.
You kind of like, no, I don't want to get involved in that. I had that instance yesterday, actually, and it's like, I don't really want to get involved with that, but you
can't really say no, right?
No, that's right. No, you just got to take the rough with the smooth, as they say.
So since we're talking about very deep designs of different infotainment systems, I want to talk to my assistant for today, Tom. Could you pull up the website, please? Is it on there? Oh, perfect. So please go to the BMW i7. I think you've already done that. And then let me have a look at the HMI architecture. Perfect. Now, I picked the system specifically because we have other cars in the database in case anyone wants to check. But the BMW i7 is a really good example of a very in-depth infotainment system. So why don't you go ahead and click on the different tabs for me, please, and just open up a little bit just to see how far we can go for the infotainment system structure. Now, this is definitely one of the cars that has one of the deepest infotainment levels, I would say, that I've seen so far. Obviously, you said this before, it does take some time to get to know a certain feature, and it's not always easy. So do you have an opinion on how these systems could be, for example, altered to make it easier to navigate through them, not only as you as an investigator, but also maybe for users?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you got on screen there, because as Tom's going through those, sort of menus and sub-menus, it just shows you how complex a modern infotainment system is. So it presents a couple of challenges. One, from an investigation point of view, if you wanted to go through those menus and navigate to a certain area. I mean, sometimes I've got in a modern vehicle and I can't even get the mileage up, just to record the mileage, because, you've got that many different displays that can be put on the instrument cluster that maybe is working in tandem with the infotainment system as well. That it does present challenges to people that are not used to that interface, and there are so many, and not everybody has the opportunity to interact with those interfaces, which is why I was keen to see the screen's product, really, because of the way that it's been developed, and it is really useful for investigators to do that. But also from a user perspective and a distraction point of view, it can be difficult as well. I don't know the answer to your question. I really don't know, because I think it all becomes down to design, and you've got to have some really good design teams around knowing what people want, and what I want as a user and to be able to do is completely different to somebody else. If I just give you the example of somebody that's got a little bit of OCD, I need my climate control to be showing the same temperature on either side, driver and passenger. If my passenger gets in and they change the temperature on their side, I can live with it. But as soon as they get out of the car, I need to reset that. And I can find that really difficult on my own vehicle, to sometimes get that reset. So that, from my point of view, that's important to me. Because as soon as I get driving again, I need to feel settled and know that those two figures that are shining at me are the same, as daft as it sounds. Whereas 99% or 99.9% of this audience would be just like, well, that's not important to me from a design perspective. So I think it throws up a lot of challenges, and personalization it is a thing to do, is a thing that's coming in the automotive industry. We can already see that sort of transferring over from a mobile device. And I guess it's difficult for all the different infotainment manufacturers, whether they be in-house with an OEM, whether they be third party that are interfacing with an OEM, to get that user interface and to reduce those menus down. As you see, some people may want to geek out at all those different sub-menus and have all that complexity. It's really difficult when you think about how many people own vehicles globally and trying to put that into that space when we've got such a digital evolution going on, both on the smartphone itself and the vehicle itself, that I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I know from a road safety point of view, less would be best, and the number of distractions that you could have from a modern infotainment system and design certainly the car I'm running at the moment from a test point of view, which is Mercedes with the M-Buck system in. There's 3 different ways to control that. Steering wheel, control pad down by the, where the gear lever would be, and then the screen itself. And I think as a screen user in the rest of the day, I'm more inclined to go to the screen, but it's not as probably safe as using the steering wheel. And navigating on the steering wheel controls is a little bit more difficult, and I'm not sort of as accustomed to it than I am using the screen. And I think it can be a real big factor in distraction as well for drivers. And getting that sweet spot of limited menus, doing what it needs to do, is going to be really difficult, and is really difficult as we're in this phase at the moment of these infotainment systems that can be, very complex to navigate. If you just want to turn the heating down a couple of degrees, on this M-Buck infotainment system, the as well as the physical buttons for the heating, ventilation, there is the digital ones that will rise up from the from the bottom of the screen. Which I didn't know were there for weeks. And I don't know, I guess when we've got a new product and we want to put these features out, and infotainment does sell, most adverts surround infotainment and digital aspects. Long gone are the days of how efficient or how well manufactured a vehicle is. It's all around, the digital stuff. Then those features can sell. But then we go to a situation whereby electrification and people are spending a lot of time in their cars, then maybe you need that for those times when the vehicle's, when the vehicle's stationary. And whilst some of those features are reduced when you are driving and you can't access them, I think there's a lot more that can be done to narrow that down. And maybe that would be some kind of solution to, as I'm talking to you now, to improve road safety is to limit the functionality of some of the, shall we say, distracting elements of a modern infotainment system. I know that there are only certain apps that can go on to CarPlay and things like that because of a potential distraction. But for me personally, I think there are still too many, and it could be narrowed down as to what is available whilst you are actually in moving. And just to finish off, personalization, AI, I think as the either vehicle and vehicle account and owner of the vehicle become more in tune with one another, then you may end up in a position whereby you can personalize an infotainment system to the point whereby a lot of the stuff you don't need. And if I need a favorite button to reset my climate control to the same temperature at either side, then I can set that up in there. And maybe you can already do that, but I don't know about it without doing it the way that I know to do it. And that can be a lot of the things with vehicles. There is more than one way to get to the end result of doing what you're trying to do within those menus. You can often find a back door in settings somewhere to get you from, map settings. You can go in through the navigation portal itself within the infotainment system into the nav settings, but you can also find it in settings. And there are, different ways to get to different features in a vehicle as well. And I don't know how much that is down to design and convenience or what, I'm not so sure. But personalization, that connectiveness between the manufacturer or the OEM understanding what the individual is after is potentially a solution for that. From an investigation point of view, no stone is left unturned, so we might want to go into every one of those menus that are available, because if somebody says, did you check the infotainment system? Yes, I manually went through it, and then somebody produced, say, the those HMI interfaces that you've shown on screen there. Well, did you check all the infotainment system, or did you just check 20% of it? And it's difficult to know whether or not you've actually been through every screen, and that can be difficult and time consuming for an investigator as well. And I really don't see where the investigator can narrow that down other than learning that system. But you imagine how many systems are out there, and you know yourself, Denise, doing that type of work that you do.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's difficult, and you become sort of like skill set. You have a skill set in that area of understanding infotainment systems and knowing where to go for useful investigative data.
So would you say there's a difference between a desirable design that people want, or because people always want more in terms of design or functions or features, and a design that would make sense safety-wise? Just a minimum of features that would kind of decrease the chance of road collisions happening.
Yeah, but again, it's difficult. You've not only the driver in a car, you've passengers that you need to keep entertained, and how do you isolate the driver from controlling something that a passenger might want to control and do without having their own screen? And I know we see that a little bit on some of the more modern vehicles and dearer vehicles, whereby we might have that situation where the passenger has got an infotainment screen for themselves and the driver can't see that, and they're sort of compartmented off, and obviously the rear having their own screens and what have you. It could be a solution, but I think practically from a consumer perspective, trying to sell that car to somebody who's got a family is ultimately going to be a difficult sell. And as much as, you know, we could make the safest car in the world, but it probably wouldn't sell. And that's not what OEMs are about. It's trying to find that. It's trying to find that balance, really, in respect of. Well, when I say that's not what OEMs are about safety, but it's not just about safety. It's about the other things that the vehicle offers, and then it's a really difficult task that the that the OEMs find themselves in when they're developing vehicles and features on there. Yes, as somebody who's a road safety advocate, it would be, you'd never have the radio on, or you'd never have any, you wouldn't accept any phone calls, you wouldn't have that facility. But unfortunately, the world's, not like that.
Who are we kidding? That's true. Now, I can recommend you my car, because I've talked about this last time, because I have 2 hard keys, and you can control climate just by turning the wheel. That would be perfect for you.
That's right. Yeah. Well, simple is best, and maybe we will end up. I don't know. I think it's really difficult to design something that just does what it needs to do and gives the high percentage of people what they need. And sometimes we have to go down these rabbit holes to realise that actually, that's too much. And the difficulty with the automotive industry is from design and, design phase to refinement to actually getting that vehicle out there. When does a vehicle ever go out into the hands of customers, come back, get refined before it actually gets launched? It gets launched, and then we're into feeding back for the next model 4 or 5 years down the line. So maybe we will do in the future that. Maybe we're down in the weeds at the moment with a lot of this stuff, and maybe less will become more as we move forward in respect of design and features available within the vehicle. I don't know.
Now, something that you've talked about for a while is that infotainment systems, they often are a cause of distraction for drivers. And I've read this article, and there was one quote that kind of hit me, and it said, a car is basically a candy store of distraction at this point. Now, it also said that drivers are most of the time up to, I think it was 40 seconds, they're distracted from actual traffic because they're just using the entertainment system, they're using their phone. And also for a lot of people, their car has become sort of a mobile office. We take calls, we text messages, we do everything with Apple CarPlay, Android, or whatever it might be. And the level of demand for different cars is most of the time it's either moderate or high just for the driver. Now, as you work as an investigator, are those distractions of infotainment systems, are those mostly the case for those fatal road collisions, or at least to a high extent?
It's really difficult. It's really difficult to answer that in some regards, because it would be different in different markets in the world, I guess, because road safety is different, in different areas of the world. Here in the UK, we talk about speed being a factor, drink or drugs, distracted driving, mobile phone use, which you could argue, is the same, has been some of the lead causes of collisions. And for me, as a former investigator of these type of incidents and dealing with this type of stuff, a lot of these incidents are down to distraction or just human, the fragilities of a human being, look but don't see. That type of scenario whereby somebody thinks that they've looked, and they might not even be distracted by infotainment. They could be distracted by an argument they've had that morning with a partner, which causes then, a fragility within the human mind to not see things. Conspicuously issues around not being able to see, low winter sun as we've got now, and those type of things. And sometimes you just can't get to those answers unless somebody's truthful and honest with you that they were actually distracted by the infotainment system. And from an investigation point of view, it's really difficult to prove that with the amount of infotainment and distraction that's available in the modern vehicle these days. Years gone by, we used to talk about, careless driving being changing the radio station on a vehicle. So that was the distraction, 40 years ago when you were trying to tune, the next radio station off the receiver, and that's a distraction. So you've still got that, and the automotive industry and infotainment kind of like it, the technology is there to minimize that to a degree, so long as you know what you're doing with it. I think it is a distraction that's potentially there. It needs to be managed, and I think it's just really difficult to work out how many people have actually been distracted by infotainment versus another, fragility of the human mind, really. It's there, and people recognise it and acknowledge it to be a distraction. The automotive industry is going through a really interesting time in the sense that we've got as much infotainment, entertainment coming into the vehicle as we've ever had, but we've got these levels of autonomy as well that are starting to increase, and the two are both increasing simultaneously. And I think the risk is, there's another risk in that drivers are feeling that their vehicle is safe, so they can be distracted to a degree. And the things that you talk about, the mobile office, is it the infotainment that's distracting the driver, or is it the conversation with the other person? It's creating a means to do that, but it's difficult to know what the actual distraction was and whether or not the infotainment is a cause of it. I guess one good thing to point out around this is when somebody's having a conversation, whether it be on a mobile phone, hands-free, in the vehicle with somebody else, one key factor there is that the other person on the other end of the line, they don't know what the driver can see. They can't see what is unfolding around them at that time. So they could be in full flow and really wanting to get their point across in a conversation without being able to acknowledge where the driver's at in respect to that. And again, the driver can be then distracted by that because it's important what the other person's saying. Whereas if you've somebody else in the vehicle talking to somebody, they can also see what's going on, and they can recognise that a situation is unfolding and back off their conversation and leave that. As a passenger in a vehicle, most people would acknowledge at some point they may have had something important to say, but because of the dynamics of the road environment at the time, they've backed off their conversation, and it stops that distraction. I guess the infotainment side of things and that mobile office candy store of distraction gives the driver the opportunity for the mind, to wander and for those people on the outside of that environment but are interacting with it, they've either a part to play by being responsible and not communicating with that person while they're driving, or acknowledging that they are driving and it's not a conversation that you would be having were they in the office potentially, and that they may need to break off, from that particular conversation, whereas they wouldn't do in an office environment.
Now, something that I've heard a lot recently is once we have self-driving cars, all those problems will go away because you can do basically anything in your car because the car will drive by itself, so you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
Do you think this will change your line of work in any way? Will systems be more complicated then? Will this be easier for you? Or does it make no difference at all?
It's a difficult one to see how things are going to play out, really. I honestly believe whilst there are, you're either all computers or you're all human. And I think while you've got humans interacting with computers, there's always going to be scope for things to go wrong. And as much as OEMs and safety design engineers will, foresee every conceivable scenario and try and plan for that in the design phase, I've seen stuff that you just can't plan for. And, when you're exposed to seeing how collisions can occur and what can go on, I think it's going to be really difficult to do that. We talk about we talk about cars being automated and making things safer, but let's just stop and think about this for a minute, because a lot of the casualties in road collisions are cyclists, motorcyclists, and pedestrians who are not in a self-driving car. They're human. They're going to be doing things that, unless the machine has learned how to deal with a motorcyclist, how a motorcyclist might ride and drive differently to a car. Certainly here in the UK, our roads are maybe not say as they are in the States, whereby you've maybe got a lot of freeways and stuff like that. We've got a lot of traffic, country roads, other types of hazards that aren't particularly prevalent in other areas. And until you get a machine that's learned all those environments and different ways in which it can, I think there's going to be a phase that we go through that's going to be a little bit difficult and a little bit more protracted. When we do get into those smart cities, we've other infrastructure to consider. So when the traffic systems are talking to the vehicles, we're going to potentially proliferate the amount of investigative work that people are going to have to do to check the traffic lights were at fault, that they changed in sequence when they were supposed to do, and the messages went across from the car to the driver. Are we going to have these instances of drivers blaming the technology or on the car or in the infrastructure itself? And it's going to be a bit of an uncomfortable ride, whereby a lot of learning is going to take place between investigators and developers of smart technology.
So another thing that we see often when it comes to self-driving cars or when it comes to infotainment systems in general, a big topic is always data privacy. Now, something that I've read a lot is that modern cars are basically a privacy nightmare, and that a lot of manufacturers have kind of shifted their focus from selling cars to selling data. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I don't think car companies are what they were originally, and there's no two ways about it. A modern vehicle is harvesting data, and it'd be naive of us to think that the manufacturers and OEMs weren't utilizing that for marketing purposes or for future revenue, because they are, by virtue of the technologies that are on the vehicle and the way that the vehicle is set up. But the manufacturers would argue that that's for the user experience, because they're getting that personal information as the mobile phone providers are, and the adverts that we may get on our smartphones as a result of doing a Google search. It may benefit the end user that if you've Googled tyres because you're in need of some tyres, that your infotainment screen, flashes up that, in a couple of miles you're going to be approaching a tyre provider that's got discounts on. Is that useful? A lot of people would say that's useful and maybe want that, or have the option to have that, or the option to opt out of it. The byproduct of that, of course, is that you give your personal data up. And some people don't like the idea of that. And by virtue of the fact that some of these systems have been designed perhaps before this has been fully thought about, then yes, we, as investigators, we're like, great, there's a lot of personal data on there that can assist an investigation. But I'm at a stage now whereby, we're seeing a lot of personal data, and there's another risk here that it could facilitate more crime types as well, in the sense that if I sell my vehicle and those systems aren't secure, and I've got somebody with a little bit of knowledge around what I do, and they were potentially targeting me, then they could potentially buy my vehicle, monitor where it's traded in at, and then go and secure it and buy it. Unless the manufacturer is going to remove the infotainment module out of the vehicle and destroy it and put a new one in, there's still going to be residual personal data on that vehicle for which has not been deleted. It could have been deleted off the user interface, but it's still going to reside somewhere on that system. And
so the infotainment system never forgets.
No, well, no. It's when you trade in your smartphone, you know that it's potentially wiped as much as it can be, but there's potentially going to be some residual data there. Notwithstanding that, it's going to take a certain skill set to get that data off if you were so interested in it. But a vehicle's quite an expensive commodity as well, so you can't just start taking an infotainment module out and getting shut of it, because that's going to drop the value of the car by a significant amount. I remember a conversation a few years ago now whereby you can trade off your privacy and make the car cheaper. So I remember a conversation whereby if you wonder if this was a model, so the car's X number of thousands of pounds, £40,000, you want to give up certain data types around your car, then somebody would pay you for that, and the car becomes cheaper as you go down the amount of data that you give up. So let's say, for example, you're out in a remote area of the world whereby they need to put a weather station in, and it costs X number of thousands of pounds to put a weather station in to monitor when storms are coming. Then if you get people of that area to give up their light data, shall we say, when they're putting the lights on, when they're putting the wipers on, and all that data and the GPS data, that can be harvested. Maybe that data could replace the weather station in projecting when the next storm could be coming. Would you be happy to give your light data up, your wiper data up, and your GPS data up for X number of thousands of pounds? You then take it forward to a local authority that wants to know your chassis or suspension information, and they can identify GPS, and they can identify where all the potholes are in the roads without having to send a scanner around. Then that data could be sold off as well, and you then reduce the cost of the vehicle. And that was the sort of model going down all these different things that you could do in that side of things. If people want privacy, they've got to pay for it. Ultimately, if they don't, then maybe not. But I think there is at the moment, a lot of personal data floating around that people aren't really sure of. And we've got this disjoint between a little bit of an OEM and then a dealership, because dealers are just interested in selling cars. And as soon as you go into that showroom to buy a nearly new car or trade a car in, they're not bothered about personal data. They're just, and the consumer isn't. They're just like, new car, stars in their eyes, and and get rid of the old car. It's gone now.
Mm-hmm.
The decision has been made to trade it in. The dealer's not really taking care of it. You've got another area, the hire company area. Just think about a hire car and how much personal data is on that. A lot of hire companies, some are getting better at it now, but you return a hire car, it'll go straight around to the valet bay, but will it go around to the digital cleaning bay? Probably not. And there's a lot of personal data left on hire cars as well, and they've got a potential problem from that point of view as well, depending on what people do with the car when they've got it. We've got a lot of these guest accounts, a lot of infotainment systems having personal accounts associated with them these days. If people are starting to do that, you've other data that's been shared back with the manufacturer as well via the full, what I would call, vehicle ecosystem, in respect of it, notwithstanding the physical data that remains on a vehicle as well.
The funny thing is that I always think people basically agree to give out all their information just by connecting a phone to their car. And of course, you always have the terms and conditions, and we all know no one reads them. It is what it is.
Yeah.
But no matter how you interact with your car, data is always going to be taken from you and then just distributed to any type of way. And people are so afraid that their data is going to be leaked to some extent, or that data gets to parties where it doesn't belong. But they so freely give it up by just using those type of systems. And it's like everybody knows, but if we don't really know, if we don't know what happens to our data, I guess it's fine.
Yeah, it is. It's down to personal responsibility, and I guess those people who are, concerned about privacy will take the time to read and understand, what's going on with regards to that. But I just think it's a really difficult area to police, Denise, in the sense that if I get in an Uber and I've had a few drinks and I've no charge on my device, and I just say, can I plug my device in to charge off your car, because they've got a cable sitting there in the front, all of a sudden my personal data could now have just disappeared onto somebody else's vehicle. And what's in that scenario, what's an Uber driver or any sort of taxi driver supposed to do around, well, excuse me, sorry, but you're about to give up your personal, sign this disclaimer. Where does it end, because of the nature of vehicles, in the sense that they are a little bit communal in some areas. And I just think if people are concerned around privacy, then they need to take their own personal steps in securing that. Speak to the manufacturer, speak to the dealership, speak to the OEM. Do requests, data protection requests to the manufacturer to see what they hold about them, despite what they're being said. I may or may not have done that in the past to know what the manufacturer is storing for investigative purposes as well. But at the end of the day, we've all some personal responsibility to take around that. And unless you want to remain completely off the radar, then you're just either not going to walk into any smart city where there may be CCTV, you're not going to have a smartphone, you're not going to have a bank account. All these digital avenues that are involved in our lives now, somewhere along the line, you're giving up that personal data. And yes, there probably is a lot more that can be done in the automotive industry to acknowledge that and tighten it up a little bit with regards to. But I would say that, some are making those strides already, but the race for convenience and features and everything else, sometimes it does get a little bit forgotten about.
So, of course, those type of practices are legal because we do give up the information actively. But would you say it's ethical then?
I think it depends what you want. Do you want a vehicle that has these features and gives you that or not? Then that's the answer to the question. Then it is, ethical. If it's been done underhand and you don't know what's happening to your data, then maybe that is unethical. But it's a difficult one because you don't necessarily fully know what the manufacturer is doing with that data. Is it being anonymized and sold for marketing purposes? I give this example a lot. You know, if BMW, for example, know where all their cars are, if they anonymize all that data, they could potentially provide data to another commercial company who, say, sells fine wines. The company that sells fine wines wants to target BMW drivers. Could they work out when the majority of BMWs pass through a certain junction to then put an electronic advertisement on the advertisement board that is at that junction? Possibly so. Is that unethical for BMW to do that when it's not personal data that Noel Lowdon's driving through this junction? It's just BMW drivers if it is being anonymised. If it's a case of somebody approaches me direct and I know that the only way that they've got that information is through the OEM or the manufacturer, then I might have reasons to suggest that it's been done unethically.
So having those type of cars and those type of features and infotainment systems is kind of a trade-off when it comes to data security to some extent then. So everyone is kind of responsible for their own data as well.
It is, but I guess certainly here in the UK, if you're wanting to buy a new vehicle, then these features are coming as standard, aren't they? In the majority of cases. And, you know, the facilities for communication to be off-boarded from the vehicle are there, potentially for other reasons, because you've got eCall that's been mandated here in the EU. So you've got a car that connects to, the network and data can be off-boarded from it. So, don't know. Maybe there is a market, as we temporarily saw for, say, Nokia 3310s to come back into form. Maybe there's a market for a manufacturer to provide a vehicle that just, does a very simplistic task and doesn't have these features, and it may be a good seller. I'm not so sure, but when we think about the next generation, and I'm certainly moving on through the generations now. As a young person, would you necessarily go for that type of vehicle where constantly, and young people perhaps even more so, engage with our devices in the digital world, and they maybe expect that while they're moving? I think we're going to see a little bit of shift to the fact that certainly when I grew up, wanting to drive and learning to drive, you wanted to drive. I think there won't be as many drivers. I think people will be happy to be transported, and they won't have that passion, shall we say, as much as there was for, understanding driving techniques and understanding how the car worked and all that kind of stuff. I think you will have people that are just happy to be transported around, and some people may be still just engaged on their phone without the actual device. I think potentially car ownership is going to be on the demise, and it's just potentially, transportation is going to look very, very differently to where it's done over the last sort of, 40 to 50 years, in the sense that less people may own vehicles, and it will just become a car will be a service, like a lot of other things are in our lives, and there won't be as big a desire for people to own a vehicle. I think there's some sort of statistics around, how often do you drive your vehicle out of the percentage of time, and it's less than 10%. It's either at work parked up or it's at home parked up. And when you start to look at those figures, and we try to do this, or have done this in the past with older drivers, when we're looking at trying to convince older drivers to give up their license, and I have this conversation sometimes with my parents. You can't sometimes, because they lose their independence a little bit, but because of somebody that's been involved in investigating serious collisions, where as we do get older, we become a little bit more frail and our attention is not as good, then there is an argument in those circumstances that a lot of elderly people maybe only use the car twice a week to go to the supermarket and back, and only do short journeys. Then you weigh up the cost of insuring the car, buying the car, versus using a taxi service in this day and age. Then I think that when you start to present those arguments, and there may be some driver from the manufacturers, OEMs, to maybe market that as well, we will see, the ownership of vehicles go down, and as the levels of autonomy rise, then certainly potentially the younger generations will be more happy just to be transported and still use their smart device rather than plugging in to a vehicle. Don't get me wrong, there's still going to be people that want to own vehicles, that want to go out, that want to spend time in their vehicles. It's a big world out there. There's all sorts of different case uses for vehicles and how people want to spend their time in them and do with them. But I think as that does move forward, we will have the refinements of what's gone on, and people are already actively aware of the data privacy issues, and hopefully there will, manufacturers will get more secure with their infotainment systems, and be a little bit more open and transparent, perhaps, around how they are using the data. And don't forget, they've got the other tech industry of mobile phones to learn from, because it's all kind of following suit as to where we've been with mobile phones, to where we are going with, to where we're going with vehicles from a design perspective. And maybe we will. I don't know. It's difficult. I was going to say maybe we'll see the demise of some of the manufacturers, and we'll narrow down like we have done with the mobile phones, in the sense that there aren't as many manufacturers of phones. You're just down to sort of one or two. Will we see that same dominance in the automotive industry? I'm not so sure. Potentially, but equally, it's an exciting space. There's a lot of potential new startups, and technologies can get accelerated a lot quicker these days. Maybe we will see some others come to market, but I just don't see, say, somebody like Mercedes or Audi falling off the face of the earth in the automotive industry. Watch this video back in 10 years.
Hopefully not.
Watch this video back in 10 years when they don't exist.
This didn't age well.
Yeah. But, when you think about somebody like Mercedes, or a global brand that, involved in F1 and that kind of stuff, you just can't see, them, disappearing that quickly. And when you look at all the other brands globally that are involved in motorsport as well, as just one example, and of a global entity, you just can't see some of those. Brands disappearing as fast as some of, say, the mobile phones did, that we don't see anymore. As often as we do, such as your Blackberries. I know they still exist. Your Nokias. They're not as prevalent. I just don't see it happening as quickly as that, but who knows?
Now, since we're still on the topic of privacy, something that I've always wondered, and this is something a little different, but for the longest time, I remember when we were teenagers, we were always watching videos on YouTube about cars with dash cam, with integrated dash cams. And then we were always told, oh, you could never use those in court because it's illegal to have dash cams in your car. And now we have vehicles that are just packed with cameras in all kinds of angles. Now, would you be able to use those type of recordings or this content in court or for your investigation, or is that still off limits?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because on one side of the fence, we've had third-party dash cams in vehicles for 10, 15 years, and nobody really questions it. They either get used and people use them. Certainly in the UK, we wouldn't think twice about that being personal data. Versus a Tesla that maybe records 360 of what's going on, and can be exported by the user, and the way that we would try and access that data with either the owner's permission or speaking to the OEM directly, and whether or not it can be used. And I think ultimately it will be used, because everybody knows that it's there. Everybody puts these things onto YouTube, and we know they exist. So what would preclude that? And on a data privacy point of view, it's potentially only going to show where you were at that given time on that given day. As an open-minded investigator, some people may not want to know that you were there at that given time on that given day, depending on what you've been up to. But you would then either not make that available or you would resist it in some way. Either you wouldn't hang around, and how would you then trace that back? But I've been out of law enforcement for 7 years now, and it must be an absolute nightmare, because you look at all the Ring doorbells and other CCTV opportunities that exist that probably were still in their early phases when I left the police. And that will be a strategy for some investigations now. There will, previously I would have done a house-to-house seek and knock on doors and speak to people. Now part of that house-to-house strategy must be, Ring doorbells, and people are then potentially giving up personal data from other devices. So I think there's other areas to learn from. I don't potentially see it being an issue. I think the issues are going to be drivers deleting that data and then trying to recover it. Because if you've incriminated yourself by virtue of the fact that the car's recording what's going on, then there's a way to easily manipulate that by going into the infotainment system and just deleting, the last incident, or however you may do that. Then there might be, the need for investigation and appropriate, court orders, depending on where your jurisdiction is, around obtaining that data if you need to. But I think somebody could potentially say, no, that's my data and I'm not giving you it. And then certainly in the UK, we would potentially be making an application to the court and saying, this is a serious offence, somebody's died, or maybe not. If it's a low-level crime, then privacy might be respected. And the court would maybe give an indication as to whether or not they should be made to make that available to the investigation.
But you could potentially force people to give up that information if it was crucial to a case then.
I think so, yeah. As we have done in the past with manufacturers. I've been to court before and asked the court, I believe that this OEM has got certain data that could assist this investigation. And you do that I've seen it in not just OEMs, but in other areas of investigation. TV companies, that have got personal or private or intellectual property that they don't want to make public. And there's ways around it. You may get the court to issue a court order to say it's made available. Then if it is made available, you may have it heard in a private hearing if it is, sensitive information or commercially sensitive information to, manufacturers of devices or technology.
Now, we've been talking about infotainment systems for a long time, and you also said it's kind of its own market at this point. Now, if we have a look at phone companies, there's now about two big players that most of the people are either Android users or they love their iPhone, and there's a battle between both parties. Now, for a lot of OEMs, we see that they still develop their very own infotainment systems. Some of them use Android for the vehicle, but most do still make their own systems. Now, do you think that it would be a necessary switch for auto manufacturers to switch to maybe a Google system, or does it still make sense for them to develop their own systems?
It's a difficult. I think the manufacturer is responsible for a safety critical system, so they're going to have to be really mindful if they're going to trust a third party company with their safety critical system and with a technology that interfaces with that safety critical system. So I think at the moment there is still, and we see that now with, I think, was it only last year, Mercedes-Benz OS, was announced, and they're doing their own thing with regards to that. I think a lot of the German manufacturers potentially want to keep things in-house and private to a degree as well. If they are keen to keep that system protected, that safety critical system of the vehicle, then I think they'll want to do things in-house. And the flip side of that is they've the control and they've the monopoly over the data that's being generated. They're creating their own ecosystem and their own brand. I think there's advantages for manufacturers to interface with the likes of Google, Android, Apple. Who knows what Apple are doing in the background? They've been very quiet on their car front at the moment, and whether or not that is something that could become a market disruptor. But a lot of these tech firms, they're not car manufacturers, and for the tech firms to go the other way and become car manufacturers as well, and be able to put together safety critical systems, I think it's not going to happen. So it's how much the manufacturers want to reach out into that space to help with either providing a user experience, providing something that people are familiar with what we have already in respect of Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. I think you will see a shift potentially in staff that have worked in those environments coming in to work alongside safety engineers in the automotive industry, so that they're working together on those things rather than segregated or using the tech firm to integrate. I think you will. Not that I've spent a lot of time working in the automotive industry from that perspective, but I think if I got back to what I was talking about at the start of this conversation around the policing needing specialists in different areas, the automotive industry is going to need specialists in other areas. And I think this was spoken about. I can't remember who was talking about it a few months ago. It could have been Ford, I think, whereby, safety engineers and how the vehicle is put together to be safe is completely different to how it's put together for, infotainment and entertainment purposes. And you're never going to deploy a safety critical system from the cloud is one phrase I remember as an example. And I think maybe you will see more a shift in skill sets of staff that will work inside OEMs to create those their own for the foreseeable. Again, watch this back in 5 years and they've all gone. They've all gone. But no, I think it goes back to what I was saying before. It's a little bit slow time, isn't it? By the time if Mercedes announce their own operating system, it's not even in the hands of users. And then they've got to go through all this, phase of getting it out there, then getting feedback, and it could be a while before we do see them, doing that, just by very virtue of the fact of the way the automotive industry is. That if you're going to put a safety critical system out on the road, you need to know that it's right and it's going to do its job and it's for it's been designed to do. You don't get that feedback. You don't get that feedback straight away, and it's up to the OEMs to listen to what people want, and then go back in, redesign, and shift things forward again. How quickly they can do that, is unknown. But it never stops, and there's that many out there doing it. You can't sort of keep tabs on them all unless. Use some resource such as screens.
Now, hypothetically, if all the car manufacturers decided today that they're all going to use Android for their systems, would that make your job easier because all the cars had the same system, so you kind of know what to expect?
Yeah.
Or would it make it harder?
No, it would make it easier because you're just dealing with one system. Going forward, it would. As I touched upon before, at the moment, you've just got that many different infotainment systems out there that, some are still proprietary file systems. A lot of the technologies on them are old technologies. And this is where I say maybe some assistance from the tech side of things would accelerate that. But it would certainly make it easier once you understand and know system. And it would just mirror, vehicle forensics is what mobile forensics was 5, 10, 15 years ago. It's that same scenario. In those days, that's what digital forensics investigators were having to do, dealing with multiple different devices, whereas now, generally, if you're seizing the phone off a suspect, it's one or the other, and it's on one iOS version versus, Android's version, and then you just got to learn the nuances as to how you overcome those encryptions or difficulties of getting into devices. but you've only that one challenge. And from R&D on mobile forensics, people can just go out and buy an iPhone as soon as it comes out and work out what they need to work out as to how they may overcome getting into it, etc., and getting investigative data off it. Even if it was just one car, I'd be into potentially £30,000 to buy a new car to market, and at the moment, there's just that many of them that could be involved. You just can't service that request. So it would make it so much easier if every car had that same system in it. Yeah.
Now, one final and last question before I let you go. What do you think, what kind of challenges will your company face in the future? What is the future of your company, or what do you have planned?
Well, what we're trying to do at the moment is we've learned a lot over the last 7 years, and there is a lack of capability around this type of work. So over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've transitioned into developing a training program, and we now offer training in vehicle system forensics from start to finish, from crime scene to courtroom, taking people through the planning of an investigation at the vehicle itself, doing those manual examinations and going through all those, potential screens, using tools at the vehicle to get data off, to removing components, to then working on these solutions and rebuilding these fragmented file systems and the fragmented infotainment market that's out there at the moment for the vehicles that we see here in Europe and the UK. And so then finally, when you do get that data, understanding the limitations of the data and the nuances of the data, there's a lot of stuff that will go on with technology, such as GNSS data that comes into a vehicle. So we have an infotainment system at the moment that the receiver will receive the GNSS fixes, but immediately, if that's fallen off the road, it will then give a fix that is on the road, so that it's presenting in the user interface the actual position of where it should be, so that the map and the user interface is a nice, pleasant experience. If you don't know that those two GPS coordinates exist, and you're just going to use the one that the system has, you're going to ignore what the system originally recorded versus what it's given out to the user, that can get you into all sorts of difficulties when you get into court if you've got another expert that understands how that system's working. So we're trying to get this training out to those people that need it, because it is, even though we've been sort of doing this last 7 years, it's still new to investigators, and they're kind of sometimes taking this data on face value. And it goes back to what I said at the start. I'm a passionate investigator. I'm a passionate person about getting to the truth. Certainly when somebody's died, I'm a former family liaison officer, which means you're interacting with families that have lost somebody. You can't afford to get it wrong. So we've kind of packaged this up into a training program. And that's where we see ourselves going, as well as still keeping live on doing casework, but maybe reducing that down a little bit to concentrate on delivering the training. But then that empowers those investigators to be able to do the work themselves without us having to do the work for them. So that's what that's the sort of next phase over the next few years with regards to that. We want to concentrate on educating people around this. We've developed an application for that, and we see that being able to be spread out globally as well, to improve investigations, as the automotive industry is going to find itself going through a really interesting phase, and these incidents, whether it be collisions or crimes, are going to be continuing, unfortunately. There are too many people that die on the roads as a result of collisions, and there's a lot of crime that still goes on in this world. And we just want to be able to contribute from our knowledge and give back over the next few years, and still work on trying to develop some solutions where we meet the new challenges.
So making the world a safer place, car by car, system by system.
It's a massive task, Denise, but we're just a small cog in an extremely big wheel. And if we can do anything to help that, then that's the main goal.
That sounds good. And I hope you're going to keep doing that. And please keep us updated on what is going to happen in the future.
We will do. Thank you very much for having us today.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
It was great having you today. And I hope we're going to have a second one at some point.
Absolutely.